The royal decree descended like the heavy clang of an iron portcullis. Deep within the historic walls of Windsor Castle, a fortress where invitations carry the weight of centuries and seating arrangements dictate political destiny, King Charles executed a maneuver that caught the entire court off guard. He stripped Camilla's name from the guest list of the upcoming diplomatic reception. This was no subtle administrative shuffle. It was an unmistakable royal warning, sharp enough to freeze the palace corridors in absolute silence and leave courtiers whispering about what had finally shattered the peace. Before we unravel the deep fractures this decision exposes within the House of Windsor, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an insider update. The monarch stood motionless in his private chambers, staring at the altered document lying open on his desk. This diplomatic reception, a grand, highly formal assembly where ambassadors and international emissaries present their credentials to the British crown, carried immense geopolitical weight. It was never merely about fine dining, stiff protocol, or polite pleasantries. It served as a grand declaration to global powers that the monarchy remained unshaken. Its significance intensified because Windsor Castle itself, perhaps the most potent symbol of royal continuity, transforms every minor gesture into historic precedent. A single omitted invitee can signal a downfall. A shifted seating card can pronounce a lifetime banishment. Charles understood the precise ripples he would trigger when his gaze lingered on Camilla's designation. The official protocol roster, which meticulously dictated attendance and spatial placement, had already received final approval. Yet, the sovereign remained transfixed by that specific line as if the ink itself possessed physical mass. He had shielded her from the wolves in the past. He had stood as her protector through decades of turmoil, but on this day, personal devotion and sovereign obligation could no longer walk the same path. He delivered his decree with quiet finality. Camilla was to be excluded from the Windsor diplomatic reception. Camilla received the heavy news from a top-ranking staff member in an apartment that felt suddenly drained of air. She remained seated. She offered no protest. As she sank deeper into her chair, the heavy quietude enveloping her felt more cutting than any public denunciation. The Queen Consort recognized the sheer brutality embedded in this message. This was not a sudden bout of poor health. This was not a scheduling conflict. This was not some convenient adjustment designed to spare her fatigue. Charles had personally authorized her removal, and that reality made the betrayal cut deeper. He had refused to let the palace public relations machine shroud his decision in gentle euphemisms. A sealed memorandum attached to the revised event file only heightened the chill. The document indicated that this course of action had been debated behind closed doors for days, long before Camilla was ever informed. An influential figure within the castle had cautioned Charles that keeping her at his side risked transforming a night of global diplomacy into another chaotic royal scandal. Once the sovereign took action, the mystery expanded far beyond a simple explanation. The true question was no longer why Camilla had been cast aside, but who had successfully persuaded Charles that his wife had become a liability. Before the household could process the directive, the palace had to face the casualties left in its wake. This crisis was never confined to a single evening. It was about Charles, a monarch trapped between personal allegiance and dynastic survival. It was about Camilla, a consort abruptly forced to confront the fragile boundaries of her elevated rank. It was about William, observing the crown's public image with icy calculation. And it was about a court that recognized one terrifying reality: when a throne is left empty, the balance of power has already shifted. Charles felt the icy truth of that shift long before anyone else dared to speak its name. He was doing far more than selecting attendees for a grand night at Windsor. He was calculating how much domestic agony the crown could withstand before its external armor began to crack. The diplomatic reception carried immense stakes because it paraded the monarchy before foreign dignitaries, diplomats, and ambassadors who dissect every royal gesture for hidden meaning. Camilla's position at his right hand was never just about companionship. Her presence broadcasted domestic harmony, institutional strength, and hard-won legitimacy. Her absence broadcasted a fracture behind the palace gates. The king sat alone with the telephone just inches away, yet he hesitated to lift the receiver. He had spent decades shielding Camilla from public wrath, quiet mockery, and the freezing coldness of aristocratic drawing rooms where smiles masked deep hostility. Now, he was the one drawing the boundary line. The household secretary, the high-ranking official charged with supervising royal agendas and internal palace operations, awaited final clearance. The sovereign knew a single spoken phrase would solidify private discord into permanent palace history. He finally lifted the receiver and issued the soft command. Camilla would not appear. The meaning hit Camilla before the court official could even finish his sentence. Her hand tightened on the armrest of her chair, not out of bewilderment, but because she knew this was no administrative error. No secretary had misread the calendar. No clerk had overlooked her name. A supreme executive decision had been handed down, bearing Charles's direct signature. The Queen Consort had survived the fury of the British public before, but this wound felt entirely different because it was dealt from within the very sanctuary she believed she had secured. William analyzed the looming threat from a starkly different viewpoint. To his mind, the prestigious gathering could not be allowed to degenerate into a theater for unresolved domestic grudges or a debate over Camilla's backroom influence. The prince maintained that the House of Windsor must present an image of absolute, ironclad discipline, particularly when international eyes were scanning the castle for any hint of weakness. Catherine registered that very same urgency, though through a quieter lens. She recognized that the king's harsh decree had not materialized from thin air. It felt like the final, inevitable hammer blow of a warning that had been delivered in private, dismissed with arrogance, and now returned with devastating consequences. A single palace courtier had traced this trajectory before the rest of the staff dared to acknowledge it. The banishment did not originate with the edited guest list. Its roots lay deeper, in a specific interaction everyone had desperately tried to bury beneath a veneer of polite protocol and strategic silence. That unresolved tension had lingered over Windsor like a persistent shadow until it finally landed on the monarch's desk. Hidden beneath the immaculate schedule of the evening was the exact catalyst that forced discomfort to harden into decisive royal action. Every great dynastic rupture traces back to a single moment that onlookers later recall with chilling precision. For the household at Windsor, that moment was not a screaming match, a dirty leak to the press, or a public blunder. It was a private toast during an intimate diplomatic rehearsal dinner. Camilla had raised her glass, spoken with an excess of confidence regarding her role in representing royal continuity, and Charles watched William's face freeze before the rest of the room even registered the slip. Camilla believed she was commanding the room with grace. She assumed her sentiments would project loyalty, sophistication, and statesmanship. This diplomatic preview dinner, a select, private gathering held ahead of the primary gala to lock down tone, seating arrangements, and symbolic messaging, carried immense value because it offered the royal family one last opportunity to align their front before foreign dignitaries arrived. Every single word possessed gravity. Every individual seated at that table understood that the upcoming gala was not merely a welcoming ceremony, it was a demonstration of absolute control following weeks of domestic tension. Charles listened intently as Camilla spoke of continuity, guidance, and the vital need for Windsor to maintain a steady diplomatic voice. At the outset, her remarks seemed benign. Then, the king detected the subtle shift. She was no longer offering him quiet support, she spoke as if she expected to co-direct the monarchy's grand strategy herself. Palace protocol, the rigid code governing hierarchy, deportment, and symbolic authority, is never treated lightly within those ancient walls. To grasp at it too eagerly is to lay hands on power itself. Charles sensed the danger vibrating through the room before anyone dared break the silence. William did not voice an objection. That silence made his disapproval infinitely louder. The prince sat directly across from Camilla and set his glass down onto the table without taking a single sip, a quiet, deliberate motion that severed the atmosphere like a warning shot. He had heard all he needed to hear. He understood that a single overconfident claim tonight could become a headline tomorrow, and a headline tomorrow would invite public scrutiny over who actually guided the British crown. Camilla saw his reaction. Charles noted it as well. In that shared, breathless silence, the dinner transformed from an elegant rehearsal into a quiet constitutional crisis. High-ranking courtiers felt the atmosphere turn icy because they knew precisely what had just unfolded. Camilla's toast had overstepped an unwritten boundary. Her words implied she was claiming a guiding hand in the diplomatic messaging of the crown, a prospect that deeply alarmed the officials tasked with safeguarding the institution's image. The king maintained an outward calm, but his expression hardened as the dinner proceeded. He had spent a lifetime defending her place at his side. Now, in a single, polished toast, that very presence had begun to look like an unacceptable liability. A confidential memorandum landed on Charles's desk shortly after the dinner concluded. This document, a highly sensitive written assessment compiled for the King's eyes only, explicitly warned that Camilla's presence risked completely overshadowing the diplomatic objectives of the reception if rumors of her backroom influence followed her into the ballroom. The paper did not scream for attention. It made no wild accusations. It merely laid out the strategic hazard clearly before the sovereign and waited for his move. The warning would have remained just another document on a desk, had Charles and Camilla not met face-to-face behind closed doors. What began as a miscalculated toast was about to escalate into a direct confrontation, and the walls of Windsor were about to witness a truth no guest list could conceal. The confrontation did not erupt into shouting. That restraint made it far more devastating. Charles and Camilla met without the shield of personal aids, without the buffer of protocol, and without anyone to soften the blow. In a quiet sitting room at Windsor, the king stood beside a small wooden table, the revised guest roster lying between them, and informed her that she would not be attending. For a woman who had built her life on surviving public storms, this was an entirely different beast. This time, the storm was generated by him. Camilla stared down at the document as though the ink had delivered the verdict before Charles could even speak. She had entered that room expecting a difficult conversation, perhaps even a stern warning, but never total banishment. The Windsor salon was filled with the kind of heavy silence that only absolute power can generate, a space where every pause feels like a life sentence. Charles had already studied both the confidential memorandum, the sensitive warning prepared by senior palace advisors, and the finalized reception agenda, which detailed exactly who would arrive, where they would stand, and how the ceremony would play out. This was critical because the decision was no longer confined to internal administrative drafts. It had graduated from paperwork to physical voice, from dry procedure to intimate betrayal. Charles kept his voice low, knowing that matching her anger would only give her an opening to dismiss his authority. He explained that the diplomatic reception had to remain entirely insulated from domestic controversy, and his words landed with the weight of a public shaming dressed up as royal duty. The gala was paramount because it displayed the monarchy to foreign leaders, and any hint of internal chaos would undermine the strength Windsor was desperate to project. Camilla absorbed his explanation, but she also read the underlying truth. She was being told that her presence, once fiercely defended as the ultimate proof of stability and endurance, had now been classified as a risk. She did not take the blow in silence. She demanded to know if William had orchestrated this move, and for a long moment, Charles offered no reply. That silence spoke volumes. The prince did not need to raise his voice across the palace, his concerns had already claimed the room long before he did. Charles finally responded with measured words, stating that the situation transcended a single warning, a single dinner, or one ill-advised comment. A pattern of behavior had emerged. Boundaries had become dangerously blurred. Courtiers had grown deeply anxious, and the royal household had begun to fear that Camilla's confidence was being interpreted as a governing authority she simply did not possess. Camilla fiercely reminded him of the decade she had spent standing by his side when the world was cold, when public smiles were forced, and when acceptance had to be fought for inch by inch. Charles listened to every word, knowing each one was indisputably true. Yet, past loyalty could not rescue her now. He laid the guest list flat upon the table and uttered the final verdict: the crown must come first. In that singular moment, love lost its power to protect her status. When the heavy doors finally opened, an awaiting aide took one look at Camilla's face and knew the internal balance of Windsor had been permanently altered. The decision, however, was not born of raw emotion alone. Behind Charles's quiet words stood a massive, unyielding machinery of power that Camilla had no hope of commanding. A royal reception may present an elegant facade of champagne, military dress uniforms, and polished smiles, but behind that curtain lies something far colder: precedence, proximity, diplomatic optics, and the invisible hand of those who dictate who stands where. Camilla's exclusion exposed the brutal gears beneath the royal velvet. Charles may have signed the order, but the momentum behind it had been building quietly, page by page, in rooms she was never permitted to enter. The palace apparatus executed the change with a chilling efficiency that made the banishment feel even more severe. No one needed to raise their voice when rigid protocol could do the cutting for them. The official order of precedence, which dictates who enters first, who stands closest to the throne, and who carries symbolic weight, matters immensely because it defines how power is perceived before a single word is ever uttered. Diplomatic optics were equally critical. Foreign envoys would not merely exchange pleasantries with Charles. They would actively calculate whether the House of Windsor looked stable, united, and disciplined. A single misplaced figure could spark an international rumor. A strained smile could reveal a structural weakness. A senior courtier reached the master seating chart at dawn, pausing for a moment before removing Camilla's nameplate. That official understood the historical weight of that tiny action. Displacing the queen consort from the central royal lineup was not simple event planning, it was the rewriting of history by hand. The household secretary, charged with managing the monarch's calendar and palace protocol, had already secured approval for the revision from private secretaries and senior advisors. These bureaucrats guarded continuity at all costs because the survival of the crown relies entirely on the projection of absolute control. They were not seeking to manufacture drama, they were actively trying to prevent drama from walking into the grand hall on the arm of the king. Charles watched the updated protocol papers arrive on his desk, looking visibly aged before he even opened the leather folder. He knew that every single correction on that sheet of paper sliced directly into his private life. Camilla's name had once symbolized resilience, loyalty, and the grueling journey from public outcast to accepted queen. Now, that very same name had become a strategic vulnerability within his own house. The king had weathered massive public storms, but this was far more cruel because it required him to punish the one individual whose devotion had anchored his personal existence. Victory and suffering collided in a single, quiet act of paper shuffling. William's hand in the matter became increasingly obvious in the heavy silence that followed. The prince was not motivated by personal malice. He was driven by a cold fear that international partners would detect domestic instability and misinterpret it as a fundamental weakness at the heart of the British state. Catherine offered a gentler, yet equally serious perspective. She advised caution, yet she fully understood that symbols carry the most weight when public confidence is at its most fragile. The future queen recognized that a gala could appear flawless on the surface while harboring a deep, structural crack in every handshake. Camilla's exclusion was therefore not Charles's burden alone, it was the inevitable output of a palace system tightening around a risk it could no longer afford to tolerate. The moment her name vanished from the active roster, the dominoes began to fall. The altered list circulated from office to office, and every official who saw it understood that Windsor had crossed a line from private tension into public consequence. By the time the updated guest roster circulated through the offices of Windsor, the consequences had already caught up with Camilla. The most devastating aspect of royal discipline is its neatness. There is no shouting, no dramatic press conferences, no slamming of palace gates, just an omitted name, a replaced nameplate, and an entire corridor that falls dead silent the moment you walk through. For Camilla, the reality set in when she looked at the revised seating plan and recognized the calculated cruelty of her absence. The king would stand before the representatives of the world this week, and she would be nowhere in sight. She felt the full weight of this banishment in the smallest administrative details. The updated diplomatic reception schedule, the master blueprint mapping out arrivals, physical positions, movements, and ceremonial transitions, was already circulating through Windsor before the public had any inkling that things had changed. This mattered immensely because the palace staff always digests the truth long before the world witnesses the performance. Her banishment was no longer a private sentence handed down in a closed study, it had become an active operational directive passed from desk to desk, executed by staffers trained never to show emotion. Windsor rolled onward without a single pause. Event preparations proceeded with military precision because the palace survives by transforming private chaos into public order. Floral arrangements were finalized, arrival times were synchronized, formal greetings were rehearsed, and the great ceremonial machine refused to slow down for anyone's grief. That was the brutal irony. Camilla's presence had been erased, yet the evening marched on as planned. The institution of the monarchy could absorb the shockwave, the woman at the center of it was left to absorb the humiliation alone. Camilla scanned the updated order of arrival, looking for the lines she already knew had been deleted. Her name no longer sat beside Charles's. For a brief second, she held the document as if staring at the blank space might make her name reappear. Then, she folded the paper once and handed it back to the waiting courier. There was no scene, no shouting, just the kind of heavy silence that communicated to everyone in the room that she understood her fate perfectly. The queen consort had not been delayed by duties. She had been displaced by power. Charles crossed paths with her later that afternoon, and the heavy silence that stretched between them spoke louder than any argument. He could have offered a word of comfort. She could have demanded a final explanation. Neither did. The king gazed at her with the exhausted grief of a man who realized that duty had forced him to become his own wife's executioner, while Camilla carried the quiet agony of a woman realizing that love was not enough to protect her crown. The decision had already spoken for them both. Aides received a follow-up directive shortly thereafter. They were strictly forbidden from framing this absence as a temporary situation until Charles made a permanent decision regarding her role in future diplomatic events. That caveat made the banishment feel infinitely larger than a single missed evening. William received confirmation of the finalized list and found no joy in it. The prince reacted with a quiet, solemn gravity, fully understanding the steep human cost of the victory. Windsor had successfully protected the crown, but it had deeply wounded the family. The schedule had been adjusted, but father and son still had to navigate what this change would mean for their future. There are rare moments when the monarchy ceases to be a grand theatrical performance and reveals itself as a cold family inheritance. Charles and William met in strict privacy following the exclusion, not as public icons, not as national symbols, but as father and son standing on opposite sides of a painful, undeniable truth. Charles had preserved the crown by wounding his wife. William had secured the future by forcing the present to face its own vulnerabilities. Neither man looked like a victor. Charles entered the room carrying far more than a political decision, he carried the heavy emotional toll of it. This private Windsor meeting was monumental because no advisors stood between father and son. No official stenographer softened their words, and no sterile palace vocabulary could translate family agony into neat public policy. This was not a briefing, not a structured consultation, not another scripted transaction inside the royal apparatus. It was a father facing the heir who would one day inherit the consequences of every hard choice made today. The reception remained the ostensible topic, but the underlying question was far heavier: can personal devotion survive when royal duty demands a sacrifice? William listened patiently before offering his thoughts, and that quiet restraint gave his presence immense power. The prince had cautioned that letting the diplomatic gala become a circus of domestic confusion would be disastrous. Yet, hearing Charles openly acknowledge the pain of the wound changed the dynamic in the room. The king confessed that removing Camilla felt like tearing away a piece of his own flesh, because she was never just an official name on a roster, she was the partner who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him through decades of public hatred, family banishment, and relentless private pressure. But Charles also understood that the crown could not afford to look weak or hesitant before foreign emissaries, royal courtiers, and a highly critical global audience. William's posture softened when he recognized the profound exhaustion etched into his father's face. He was not indifferent to the pain. He understood that the blow had struck Camilla personally and Charles privately. Yet, the heir to the throne did not back down. He asserted that the monarchy could no longer afford to pay the price for institutional hesitation, not when every blurred boundary invited a new constitutional crisis. The institution survived by projecting unwavering discipline, and that discipline occasionally looked monstrous to those closest to it. That was the brutal, inescapable reality both men had to accept. Charles then revealed the truth that shifted the entire narrative. He had made the final executive call himself. He had not hidden behind William, his advisors, or the household secretary, the official who manages the royal calendar. He had personally analyzed the warnings, studied the guest list, and accepted full responsibility before issuing the order. That admission was critical because it transformed the exclusion from a backroom palace coup into a defining act of kingship. Camilla had not been pushed out by whispers and shadows, she had been removed by the husband she trusted most. William accepted his father's words in silence, and the emotional tension in the room shifted without any dramatic flair. The decision was no longer merely a strike against Camilla or a victory for royal caution, it became a defining milestone of Charles's sovereignty, a painful, definitive proof that he could place the crown above his own heart when the institution demanded it. Father and son stood together in that uncomfortable understanding, both carrying different wounds, both fully aware that Windsor had crossed a threshold that the world would soon judge. Within the secure walls of Windsor, the decision had found its purpose. Outside the gates, it was about to find its jury. By the following morning, the palace could no longer contain the symbolic fallout. The story escaped the whispered corridors of court and exploded into the public arena. The British public did not view the exclusion as a simple diary adjustment, they read it as a major royal statement. A single missed appearance was interpreted as a national message. An altered guest list became a public test of Charles's authority. A single front-page headline transformed Camilla's private humiliation into the most talked-about royal drama of the year. Charles monitored the media coverage in absolute silence, and that silence conveyed more to his staff than any written press release could. Broadcasters were no longer treating the change as a minor edit to the royal calendar, they framed it as a massive tectonic shift in the palace power structure. Diplomatic receptions are not ordinary high society parties, they are highly formal constitutional events where the sovereign hosts foreign ambassadors, and they matter because the world views these evenings as a barometer of royal stability. If the king stands alone when his consort was expected at his side, the public does not see an empty space, they see a rupture. Camilla watched the media storm from a distance, and that physical isolation only made the public scrutiny feel more punishing. She remained sequestered far from the gala preparations while her name dominated panels and talk shows she had no power to influence. Palace publicists drafted careful, sterile statements, selecting words designed to dampen the media firestorm without revealing the deep family wound. But her absence was far too blaring for clever public relations to hide. The Queen Consort had not stepped back of her own free will, she had been deliberately excluded from an event where her presence was meant to signify acceptance, unity, and survival. That was why the public reaction cut so deep. The public possesses an innate understanding of royal symbolism, even when the palace refuses to explain the details. Charles's face hardened when commentators pivoted from global diplomacy to the state of his marriage. The king had taken action to safeguard the crown, yet the unfolding narrative now exposed the devastating personal cost of that defense. Every news broadcast highlighted the same glaring paradox: his sovereign authority appeared stronger than ever, but his private world looked completely shattered. He had chosen institutional discipline, but that discipline had generated immense human suffering. The monarchy appeared completely in control, while the family behind it looked deeply wounded. Then came the defining image that captured the morning news cycle. A major national newspaper published a front-page photo of Windsor Castle silhouetted against a dark, stormy sky, accompanied by the brutal headline, "The empty space beside the king." It was simple. It was devastating. It transformed an internal palace decision into a national verdict. Outside the gates of Windsor, crowds began to form. Some citizens defended Charles for finally setting a firm royal boundary, while others quietly questioned whether Camilla had been publicly humiliated before the entire country. No official statement could erase that lingering question. William grasped the full power of the public reaction before anyone else dared voice it. The prince knew the public had moved past mere curiosity, they were watching intently to see whether the crown would stand its ground or retreat under pressure. Camilla's absence had become the ultimate test. Charles's authority had become the answer waiting to be delivered. As the hour of the reception drew near, the question was no longer whether Camilla would make an appearance, but what her permanent absence would finally prove. And when the doors finally opened, the monarchy delivered its verdict without saying a single word. The grand reception proceeded as planned, and that reality was the ultimate verdict. Diplomats filed into the historic halls of Windsor Castle. Charles assumed his position. The receiving line began to move. The formal greetings commenced. And the empty space at his right hand communicated everything the palace had spent days refusing to put into words. Camilla's absence did not cause the monarchy to buckle, instead, it brought the institution into sharp focus. For one unforgettable evening, Windsor demonstrated to the world that even love, loyalty, and personal history must bow when the crown decides to survive. Charles conducted himself with absolute poise because the gravity of the night demanded nothing less. The diplomatic reception, the grand constitutional event where foreign ambassadors are received by the crown, carried immense stakes because it proved to global observers whether Windsor could remain rock solid in the wake of private turmoil. The crown, meaning the enduring institution of the monarchy itself, rather than the personal feelings of any single individual, had to appear infinitely stronger than the wound hiding behind it. The king understood that every handshake would be scrutinized as evidence. If he faltered, the exclusion would look like an act of panic. If he stood firm, it would become an act of supreme authority. Charles greeted every diplomat with the calm composure of a man who had already paid the price of admission before entering the room. Yet, a brief, fleeting glance toward the vacant space where Camilla should have stood revealed what no amount of royal poise could fully mask. He had not banished a stranger, he had banished the woman who had shared his storms, weathered decades of public hatred, and waited by his side through the long, grueling years. That was the raw agony beneath the glittering surface. The monarchy appeared flawlessly controlled, but the man at its center looked quietly, permanently marked by the choice he had made. Camilla remained within the walls of Windsor, but the physical distance had become its own prison sentence. She was no longer angry in the sharp, immediate way she had been when the news first broke. Something much heavier had settled over her. The queen consort finally understood that being close to Charles did not equate to holding power beside the crown. Proximity had failed to secure her standing. Devotion had failed to protect her rank. The realization cut deeper than any newspaper headline because it came from inside the very life she believed she had finally made safe. William observed the evening unfold with a quiet, resolute satisfaction, fully understanding the historic line Windsor had just crossed. This was no joyful triumph for him, it was a sobering confirmation that the future of the monarchy would demand far more rigid boundaries, clearer definitions of duty, and absolutely no room for personal hesitation. He watched his father stand alone on the dais, knowing that the decision could never be reversed without fatally weakening the very institution it was meant to protect. The future king did not celebrate Camilla's downfall, he measured its institutional value. The ultimate revelation of the night was brutally simple: Charles's exclusion of Camilla was not an act of weakness, panic, or petty punishment. It was his most profound declaration that the crown must always come before personal comfort. This moment signaled that he had finally chosen kingship over personal devotion. Camilla had discovered the hard, unyielding boundary of her position. William had watched the future of the monarchy take shape in real time. Windsor had reminded everyone that survival demands sacrifice from those standing closest to power. The evening concluded not with a warm reconciliation, but with absolute, icy certainty. Windsor had chosen the crown, and every soul within those walls now understood the price of that choice. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video.